Chances are, if you are anywhere outside of Europe right now, your land was once colonized by a European power. The last 600 years or so of world history has been largely defined by the age of exploration and the imperialism that followed, with European powers discovering new lands that were more often than not already inhabited by natives. That didn't stop Europe though, and from the 15th to the 20th century, we saw the emergence of plenty of global colonial empires. The land I'm currently recording this video from in Massachusetts was originally inhabited by the Wampanoag people and eventually became part of the British Empire, the largest colonial empire in history. With so much of the world under European influence in the last 600 years, this got me wondering, when was every European colonial empire at their peak? To get a couple rules for this video out of the way, by peak I just mean when did the empire in question control the most land? When it comes to colonial empire definition, things can get a little foggy and there will be at least one empire in this video that you could make the case shouldn't have really been included. Hell, you can make the argument that the Roman Empire was a European colonial power and you'd probably have a pretty compelling case. But for the purposes of this video, we're only going to be looking at European empires that existed from the 1400s and 1900s that controlled significant territory outside of the mainland borders of their country. So sorry Austro-Hungarian Empire, the islands off the coast of Croatia don't count as a major territory outside the mainland. But for example, the Portuguese Empire controlling Brazil would count. Got it? Okay, let's get started. We'll go in alphabetical order. The Belgian Empire was historically one of the most brutal imperial powers, with certain practices in the Congo that would get me demonetized if I talked about, which can only be described as pure evil. At their territorial peak from 1922 to 1931, they controlled the aforementioned territories in the Congo that are the modern-day Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. From 1885 to 1908, this territory was actually the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium until the Belgian parliament pressured him to hand it over to the Belgian government to control. During their peak, they also controlled a piece of the Chinese city of Tianjin, which was split between many different foreign powers at the time. The British Empire was the biggest empire in world history by most measurable metrics, including territory of course. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment of their territorial peak because they controlled that much land, but most reliable sources place the date between the years of 1913 and 1922. At this time, they controlled about 26% of the entire landmass of the world, including but not limited to modern-day Canada, India, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, Sudan, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, Yemen, Nigeria, Ireland, Tanzania, Kenya, Antarctica, Belize, Bahamas, Guyana, Jamaica, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Golden Coast, Oman, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Thailand, Brunei, Papua New Guinea, and so many more various islands and ports around the world. Before World War II, they were the world's only superpower, and I think you can all understand why. The sheer magnitude of the territorial control that they exerted is something that the planet had never seen before and probably will never see again. The other wild part about all of this is that it wasn't that long ago. 1922 was barely over 100 years ago. My great-grandmother was alive during this time and she's someone that I met during my lifetime. There are plenty of people alive today in the countries that I just listed that were technically born as subjects of the British Empire. The Danish Empire was another relatively small colonial empire compared to their neighbors that never even technically considered themselves an empire. During their union with Norway from the 16th to the 19th century, the country possessed plenty of smaller overseas ports and trading outposts in Africa, Asia, and North America, and the only significant landmasses they held outside of Europe were Iceland and Greenland, the latter of which they still control to this day. Their territorial height was in 1814, right before they lost Norway as a result of Napoleonic Wars, and would begin to lose their overseas ports in the decades that followed. They were never involved in the Scramble for Africa later in the 1800s and the colonization that ensued. During the 1600s, the main competition for the growing British Empire was the Dutch Empire. Based on what we talked about earlier in this video, you can probably guess which one of those two emerged victorious in terms of the greatest global influence, but the Dutch managed to control quite a bit of territory for being such a small country in Europe. Some of you might know that New York City was not originally a British colony and was actually first settled by the Dutch, being named New Amsterdam after their capital city back home in the Netherlands. The British would end up capturing the land in 1664, and the Dutch Empire would be in a state of relative decline from that point onwards, with the height of their territorial influence being in the year 1652. The most famous colony was probably modern-day Indonesia, which they held all the way until 1945, but one thing I did not know prior to researching this video was that the Dutch actually controlled parts of Brazil at one point, prior to Portugal expanding their influence in the area. The second largest colonial empire, behind the British of course, were their historical rivals the French. The French Empire can actually refer to several different political entities throughout history because of how often France likes to change their government structure. In this video, I'm not referring to the French Empire that expanded into Europe under the reign of Napoleon. No, I'm talking about the French Empire that came after, considered the second French colonial empire, which was at their territorial height from 1919 to 1939. They held colonies in Saharan Africa, Syria, Madagascar, Vietnam, Cambodia, and various other smaller territories throughout the globe. You might be asking why the famous colonies of the Louisiana Territory and Quebec in North America aren't included here, and that's because by the time of their territorial height, France had already sold Louisiana to the United States over 100 years earlier and lost Quebec in the French and Indian War. Imagine what the world would have been like during World War I and II if the French still controlled all their former colonies in North America. The German Empire was a relatively short-lived political entity due to Germany unifying in 1871, which was hundreds of years after other European powers had begun colonizing. However, having only existed for less than 50 years, they managed to play an impressive game of catch-up. We're talking specifically about the Second Reich here, because the Holy Roman Empire preceding it and Nazi Germany succeeding it were for the most part contained to the European mainland. The height of this iteration of the empire was right before World War I in July of 1914, where they held modern-day Tanzania, Namibia, Cameroon, Togo, and part of Papua New Guinea, as well as plenty of ports in the Pacific. Of course, pretty much all of this would be taken from them just 4 years later after they decisively lost the First World War. The Italian Empire was another short-lived prospect, although they did make it past World War I unlike the Germans. Their height was from October to November 1941, in the midst of World War II before the Allies began occupying their African territories and eventually the mainland. During this time, they made territorial gains in the Balkans and were able to finally gain control of Ethiopia for a brief period of time after the Second Italian-Ethiopian War, after they famously lost to the Ethiopians the first time. They also had control of modern-day Libya, Tunisia, Somalia, and parts of Sudan, Egypt, and Kenya. After losing World War II, they of course lost plenty of this territory, and this was during the time where most European powers began to decolonize anyway, so the Italian Empire was unlikely to ever be a long-term prospect. The Portuguese Empire is by far the oldest one on this list, starting in 1415, which was nearly 80 years before the next European power, Spain, started theirs in 1492. Exactly 400 years later in 1815 would be the peak of their territory, with the vast majority of it coming from Brazil, one of the biggest European colonies to ever exist. They also had small pieces of African coastline during this time, including modern-day Mozambique and Angola, as well as plenty of ports throughout India and the Pacific. For being such a small country on the map, Portugal being able to occupy Brazil for as long as it did is pretty impressive, and obviously Brazil still contains plenty of Portuguese influence to this day. You can argue that the Russian Empire doesn't technically belong on this list by my own criteria, because Alaska used to be connected to the Russian mainland by ice bridge, but this was thousands of years ago, and by the time the Russians colonized it, I think it should fully count as an overseas territory. This empire was incredibly massive, covering all of what would later become the Soviet Union, a huge entity in and of itself, but also incorporating even more of Eastern Europe, Finland, and of course, Alaska. Sure, most of this land was icy tundra that was uninhabited then and still is today, but the pure scale of it all is still wildly impressive. They peaked in the year 1866, right before they sold Alaska to the United States in 1867. In 1790, the Spanish Empire reached their peak after being started about 300 years earlier. Similar to Portugal, most of their holdings were in the Americas, including pretty much all of South America besides Brazil, as well as all of modern-day Mexico, El Salvador, Cuba, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Belize, Panama, Honduras, Costa Rica, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Haiti, Dominican Republic, more than half of the United States, most of the Philippines, most of the rest of the Caribbean, and even parts of Canada and Alaska. The influence here is pretty obvious because most of the places I just listed have Spanish-sounding names and still speak the language to this day, including plenty of areas here in the United States. For a while, they were the dominant colonial power on the globe, but as we all know, Britain would eventually take that position from them. Sweden is the last empire we're covering today and is actually tied with another Scandinavian country, Denmark, for having the earliest peak on this list, that being in the year 1652. Sweden barely makes the cut as a colonial empire for their overseas territory. At this time, they only had a small colony in the modern-day United States, near where modern-day Delaware and New Jersey meet, and they ended up surrendering that to the Dutch in 1655. They also had a few very small ports along what is the modern-day Ivory Coast in Africa. Sweden was very briefly a major European power during the 1600s, but as you can tell, they did not hold this status for very long. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, be sure to subscribe because next week, I'll be releasing a video ranking these empires from worst to best based on their strength and their influence. Depending on when you're watching this video, that video might already be out, so be sure to check the description and I'll provide a link. Thanks again for watching, I'm Bay State History, and I'll see you next time.